Welcome to part two of the Intro to America series, and this episode will be on the pre-Columbian exchange and the French and Indian War. For those that have seen part one in the beginning of, or rather the end of 2024, and have been waiting 5 months for the next episode, my apologies. Got a bit busy, but here we go with part two. So this second part of the series is going to delve into really the early days of the American story, the colonial era, the pre-colonial era, into the colonial era, and essentially the lead up to the American Revolution. So getting into America previous to European contact. The population, or before getting into population statistics, the geographic size of both the North and South American continents is quite large, at about 42 million, over 42 million square kilometers. And when looking at the contiguous, what makes up the current contiguous 48 U.S. states, that's about 8 million square kilometers. So this is a quite large swath of land, and it has a great degree of geographic and environmental diversity. You have the Great Plains, the eastern woodlands, the southwest, more desert terrain, and the forests of the Pacific Northwest. And when looking at the pre-European contact era, there are several major civilizations and cultural groups to consider. From Mississippian culture, we see mound building societies, trade and trade networks. The Pueblans and their preceding forebears, the Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, and also advanced irrigation and cliff dwellings. In the Northeast, you have several groups of people living, including the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee people, which had a political alliance consisting of early democratic principles, and some depth could go into how that influenced the founding fathers of the United States, and that's a whole other topic to itself. Pacific Northwest tribes, the Great Plains, groups like the Lakota, the Comanche, who lived nomadic lifestyle that consisted of practices such as bison hunting. And there were trading networks throughout the continent, and an economy, which is often underlooked by people that might not necessarily be familiar with pre-European Americas. There are trading routes throughout the continent, and we see evidence of shells and copper being traded. And of course, when getting into agriculture, the concept of the three sisters, which is corn, beans, and squash. So getting into some details on the sociocultural structures of these early peoples of the Americas, there are examples of both matrilineal and patrilineal societies. And governmental systems mainly consisted of clans, basically clan-based tribal councils. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'm probably going to get into more detail on episode 3, but there's influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on later American democracy. To touch a little bit on culture and religious beliefs and practices. A lot of examples of animism, so the belief that natural features, such as rivers and animals, have spirits, and examples of oral tradition and storytelling. Now, we don't have written linguistics, and from the perspective of someone that has studied history as both an undergraduate and graduate student myself, historians like to look to written documentation, as it is generally more accurate um, than orally passed down tradition. But nevertheless, orally passed down tradition is one of the key sources we have of considering America before European contact. That being said, there are accounts and details that were later written down, but that's something to consider. In terms of motivations for European colonization, there were many driving incentives and stimulus forces that had an impact in the resulting colonization of the Americas by the Europeans. So this can be brought down into economics, religion, politics, strategy, science and exploration, and social and demographic facets. So to focus on economics specifically, and this is particularly the case for the conquistadores of Spain, the colonial projects of Portugal as well. The concept of El Dorado, the idea that the New World held large quantities of gold and precious metals. So there is the influence of the search for gold, silver, and other valuable resources. And there's also the component of mercantilism and trade, that the colonies are a means to control raw materials and new potential markets. At the time, just to go at one example, ships that were built for military use as well as for trade were made of wood, and the forests of Europe had limited capacity, growing populations. The New World presented in that component an area where additional resources could be attained for purposes of shipbuilding, for example. Now, for religion, there's the missionary component. That's especially the case for the Spanish, the Portuguese and French Catholic missionary work within the New World, and there's the religious freedom component, especially for those coming from Northwest Europe, from England, from what's now Germany. At the time was many different states, also the Netherlands. People coming to practice freely their respective religious practice. Different Protestant sects, whether it be the Puritans and the Pilgrims, they sought to escape persecution for their religious practice in Europe and come to America. The Puritans specifically settled mainly in what's now New England, in the New England region. Now, for politics and military, and I've touched on this a little bit, but I've touched on it specifically, how it kind of connected to economics, in that the new world, the Western Hemisphere, had resources that can be utilized by different European empires. This was a period of which could arguably, which has certainly, when looking at the record, uh, started long before the period of colonization and lasted long after, probably until the Second World War and beyond, is the goal of these different European states to expand their territories, to get an upper hand. And you see constant, century after century, throughout this period. And as I mentioned, till up until the Second World War, countries like England and France constantly being at war, dynamics with the different Germanic states, Spain having their exploits. So there's a lot of military conflict in Europe, and when thinking about the New World from a strategic vantage point, it was seen by some as a means to further expand their realms and possibilities by looking at this territory thousands of miles away. Now, getting into exploration and scientific endeavor, this is an important one. economic and social structures in the early colonies. So when examining the economic situation, the social hierarchy, it varied per region for a variety of reasons. But there was certainly not uniformity when thinking about this era of the American story, as is a bit different from the dynamics we see today. So in the New England region, the Northeast, things largely consisted of small farms, shipbuilding, trading, and fishing. For the middle colonies, agriculture was the base, was the foundation, and there are some examples of pre-industrial manufacturing. This region was coined the breadbasket of the colonies, at least the breadbasket of the colonies of England, what became the 13 colonies. Now, in terms of this pre-industrial manufacturing, this was pre-industrial revolution, and so the machinery, the mechanisms, and basically theories behind how to produce project at scale that later came into prominence wasn't really at play at this point in history. But as mentioned earlier, we are going into the Enlightenment era, the ages of reason and thinking in ways that people previously have not. So we're kind of when thinking about this point of history, on the edge of some of those developments which would come relatively early on in America as an independent sovereign country, which happens a little time later. In terms of the southern colonies, they were plantation-based. It was a plantation-based economy, and we're talking products specifically tobacco, indigo, rice, and later cotton. But cotton as a product became particularly prominent when America, the United States, was later sovereign of any European power. In terms of labor practice, we see the widespread usage of indentured servitude, which were contract workers from Europe, from places like England and Germany, people from lower socioeconomic background that were in debt, that were accused of false crimes, a variety of circumstances of life, which led them to taking a contract as a indentured servant in the colonies in America, in which they would work for a said period of time and eventually become free to be their own person, if you will. But in the Southeast, we see the practice of slavery. And this practice quickly spread in the southern regions, and it became the backbone of this plantation economy. And for the African slaves that were brought to the American Southeast, they had no prospects of freedom in the way that their indentured servant counterparts did. Now, when thinking about slavery, this system went beyond just the American Southeast. Matter of fact, a majority of African slaves brought to the New World were brought south of what's now the United States and what is now countries like Brazil, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, all places where African peoples were brought to engage in labor on places of work, particularly plantations. And in the United States, this was especially the case in the southeast region. So this social hierarchy was could be thought of as a class system that consisted of land-owning elites, which dominated power at the top. And these individuals were mainly from northwestern Europe. And there is a middle class, or you could say, I put this in you think about this in parentheses, but a middle class. This is pre-industrial. We haven't really gotten into anything what would be considered the modern middle class, but we have the middle class, the lower class, which consisted of small farms and even artisan laborers. And at the bottom of this social hierarchy were slaves and indentured servants, but slaves were on the very bottom of this hierarchy. And to really think about some key takeaways when thinking about this, the slavery system became a dominant structure, which society was shaped around in the South, and that was a plantation system. So the French and Indian War and its consequences. For purposes of this analysis, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the war itself, but I'm going to talk about center on the consequences of this war. And that's because this war had a significant impact on America becoming an independent sovereign country. Without the French and Indian War, American history would have been much different. Now, for factors I'm later going to get into, regardless of whether or not the French and Indian War occurred, the U.S. states would have eventually got independence from the British Empire. Like any empire, the British Empire was not sustainable, and was something that more or less had a fate to ultimately collapse. But that's a conversation for a different day. The question is, why did the United States gain independence? Why declare independence in 1776? How do we get to a point where in the late 1780s we have the Constitution of the United States both written and ratified, and then the Bill of Rights with our first 10 amendments? Not to get ahead of ourselves. That largely stems from the resulting dynamics created by the French and Indian War. This was an eventful war that spanned globally between the British and the French empires, as issues and engagements in war went beyond merely the North American continent. The consequences of this were huge. So, to end the war, there was a treaty signed between the British and French called the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And as a result, France lost significant spans of territory in the North American continent. The British Empire gained significant territory east of the Mississippi River, and territories which now make up Canada. As a result of contesting this war, there was a massive debt burden accrued. Britain accrued a heavy debt and sought ways to pay this back, and they moved forward with actions such as the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and other taxes to be placed on the colonies. Now, this is all amidst the colonies not having any representation in Parliament. There were mounting disputes as well with the Native Americans. So from 1763 to 1766, there is a war called the Pontiac Rebellion, and this was a response to the British Empire's territorial expansion. And in 1763, though, there was a proclamation that forbid further western expansion by the British Empire, and that was to limit anger and hostile actions taken by Native Americans that would feel increasingly threatened as their land was encroached upon. But many colonists continued to encroach on this anyway. And there's also escalating tensions at this time between the British government and the American colonies. The British were also increasing their military presence in these territories, in these colonies. The colonists were angered at the higher taxes and increased British military presence. And we have a pathway to the American Revolution. The British policies post-French and Indian War ticked off the colonists, and ideas and concepts of self-government gained traction. The philosophies of the Enlightenment, new ideas that were challenging the legitimacy of monarchical rule were becoming increasingly prominent, particularly when looking at what became the ruling class of the early American Republic. And we then saw a pathway towards U.S. independence. Now there was a reaching of a breaking point, and taxation without representation became a significant issue. In response to taxation by British government to recover debts, there were significant protests and backlash by the colonists, which included organized boycotts and the formation of organizations, including the radical Sons of Liberty, that often would engage in violence with British officials. Now, in 1770, there was a Boston Massacre, in which 5 colonists engaging in protests against British policies were shot and killed by a volley of fire fired from British troops. And there was ensuing significant media promotion that continued the fuel of anti-British sentiments throughout the colonies. And organizations like the Sons of Liberty engaged increasing traction. The 1773 Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party are other pivotal moments on the journey towards the American Revolution. The British policy attempts to mandate the colonists to exclusively purchase British tea received huge backlash. And of course, the Boston Tea Party, a group of these American patriots, climbed the ship in Boston Harbor and dumped the tea into the sea. And there was the Intolerable Acts of 1774, and these were harsh measures, and they were specifically aimed at Massachusetts being the hotbed of the American independence movement. Also in 1774, we see the formation of the First Continental Congress. Colonial leaders organized in the colonial leaders organized. They organized in a united structure to oppose British policy and rule and move towards a direction of independence. We have ourselves now, at this point, in looking at developments, a pathway to the American Revolution. The British sought to increase control in colonies, while colonies demanded rights and measures in spirit of the Enlightenment tradition. The laws and policies by the British to bring debt under control further angered resentment and anger. It further basically incentivized the colonists to not be too pleased with the current ruling situation. And of course, famously, the 1775 first shots fired The engagements at Lexington and Concord, the American Revolution was then underway, and we'll get more into that in part 3. But again, I want to apologize for it taking so long to publish this second episode. I know the first episode was posted on my YouTube channel. I posted that right before the end of 2024, and it really wasn't my plan for part 2 to take 5 months to release. And I also will concede that the quality should definitely be better, but I have a lot on my plate and can only do so much. But if you stick with me, I'll try my best to provide you a quality part 3. With that, I hope you enjoy the video. Please leave any comments, suggestions, ideas below. I'm going to continue my plan of completing this History of America series and see where we go from there. Everyone, take care. Have a wonderful day. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. Please, connect with me on medium.com. Follow my blog. Follow my Substack. You could just search my name, and I should come up. With that, take care.